the unmistakable sounds of a carnival, although these days you won't find the freak shows and the raw violence of the set-em-up, knock-em-down tent show boxing troupes, once essential ingredients of a country fair. Former Australian welterweight boxing champion Terry Riley won his title in 1940, but before that had to do his share of tent show boxing. 3 rounds against anyone game enough to try on the gloves. Terry Riley was a fit 74-year-old when he was interviewed in Melbourne by Harry Martin. He's talking about how the tent boxing troupe used to work up interest when they arrived in town.
The fellas that were the G's, they called them, the G's, the fellas that were out in the crowd to come in to fight the tent fighter, they weren't allowed to be seen around with the tent fighters. And they'd arrange with the local fighter. The local fighter's the one who draws the crowd. The locals all come to see the local fighter. They're not interested in the tent fighter. You find out when you come into the town, the local fighter generally comes up, or anyone who can box a bit in the town generally comes up and sees the boss about arranging fights.
So this was to make sure that you got good crowds along, and this was arranged at the start when you first arrived in the town.
That's right. The local fighters generally came around as soon as you got into the town with the tent.
Yeah, having seen a few tent fights, they always look pretty wild and torrid affairs. Was there a general strategy as soon as the bell went to rush straight out and catch the person?
Well, there's a lot of showmanship, but you fought. Lots of times you fought fellas that had no experience but were big and strong and tough, and they were hard fellas to fight. The tent fighter had generally been taught boxing somewhere, but those outsiders were 99 times out of 100 they're just naturally strong, tough fellows. They hadn't had any boxing experience, or not much boxing experience, or not much boxing education. Now and again you'd strike a fellow who's a hard puncher, a strong, hard, tough puncher, and they were hard to handle then. Occasionally they'd land a hard swing punch on you, but they were swinging punches and they'd never been taught, majority of them hadn't been taught to box, and they were easy to make them miss or easy to block their punches. I remember there was a big Aboriginal, we were down at Bairnsdale show, doing a show there, day and night show there, and there was a big Aboriginal, he wanted to fight me all the time. Every time I got to be at he was a lot different in weight, he was 3 or 4 stone heavier than me probably, but he kept claiming me all the time to fight me, and the promoter, the tent manager, he wouldn't put him on because he was too big for me. But anyway, to finish up, he put him on. And we went around the back of the tent, the living tent, to put his nicks on. And he said to me, "Hey, Jack, don't hit me in the belly. I've been drinking wine all day." I said, "I won't hit you in the belly. I'll hit you on the chin." I said, "and hard, too." Well, anyway, as soon as I landed on him, he gave up. But he was a real big fellow, which you had to be a bit careful with him because he was enormous size.
Did you ever get decked in any of those events?
No, I was pretty lucky. I'd had a lot of experience before that, and I'd had a few fights and that, and I'd had a lot of boxing experience, but I was lucky. I was never sat down. You'd box along with the outsider, with the tent fighter, with the visitor, the local fellow, and you'd carry him along, make him look good, because he was the one you had to carry years later on in the afternoon or night.
So you'd try and develop a bit of drama, maybe make it look as though he had you for a moment and encourage the crowd to think he might even win.
They'd get a bit groggy from a punch or things like that, or you'd put on a bit of an act after a punch, and that just to get the local crowd in, because they were the ones who were paying to see the local fighter.
They were pretty hard days when it was difficult to get a job and even get money. What sort of income could you get at that?
Oh, you wouldn't get much. You might a fella fighting main fights in Melbourne, he might get £5 a day, he might get £10 a day. Well, he might have to have 3 or 4 fights during the day in the tent, which wasn't much money in those days. But if he was a draw card in Melbourne and well known to the public, well, they'd use him as a draw card on the tent.
What was the most number of fights you ever had in a day in the tent?
Oh, you'd have some shows you do a day and night. Well, you might have 6 fights day, afternoon and night.
It looked a pretty rough sort of existence. What was it like getting around in terms of where you stayed and the whole thing generally?
It was pretty rough. The living was pretty rough because you were only just laying on the canvas of a night inside the big tent. You had a living tent and a big tent, and they'd all sleep alongside each other on the side walls of the big tent inside the big tent.
And do your own cooking and all that sort of thing?
Well, yes, you'd cook. You'd do your own cook. Frying pan most of the time.
What, a bushfire outside?
That's right, yes. When you were young, it was a bit of a novelty for you. When you were young, and you thought it was good to get around, and people made a fuss of you. But as you got older and tougher, and a bit worn. Well, you weren't so keen about it.
Did you ever get fellas who'd perhaps lose in one town and they'd try to be hurt and feel they had to chase the show and come after you in another?
Well, that's right. In those towns, like a town like Wangaratta, well, you'd get fellas from Albury and Wodonga and places like that. They'd come a few miles to fight in the tent. And the same thing at within 50, 60 mile of Melbourne, Warrigal or Bairnsdale and places like that, well, you'd get fellas that come a few miles to fight in the tents there.
Given the wild sort of punches that you can see in those kinds of fights, I guess if one does connect, it could do some damage. You ever see boxers get really hurt in the tent?
Oh, occasionally they get hurt, but they keep their hands up and they block punches, and after they've been in the tent a while, they don't punch together. One fella punches and then the other fella punches, and one fella covers up while the other fella punches. They put on a bit of a show, you know. It sounds good, glove on glove, hard punches.
Did you ever see any really potentially good boxers who got involved in the tents and never got out of that situation and perhaps wasted potential?
No, when a local fella showed a bit of promise in the tent, well, the promoter of the tent, the showman, he'd take him around to perhaps another show, and lots of times he'd get him fights in Melbourne or the capital cities like Sydney or Melbourne.
So fellas actually launched their careers from the tent.
That's right. There's been a lot of good fighters, a lot of champions, a lot of Australian champions who started off and been discovered in the tent. Mickey Miller, Jack Hassan, they were tent fighters for sure. Leo Kid Young, he fought a little bit in the tent for Sharman, and there was lots of fellas that did start off in the tent, found out they could fight through getting in the tent.
One hears stories of boxers going off on some of those interstate treks and finishing up owing the promoter rather than having an income. Were there some crooks in the business?
There's a lot of those stories told. Like everything else, they dramatise things, but I don't think there was anything like that went on. You just worked for wages off the tent, and that was all you've got. If you worked for them, you got paid. And the local fella, he was the one who drew the crowd. Lots of times he'd be getting more than a tent fighter because he was the one that people were going in to watch.
How much might he get?
Oh, he might get £10 for a fight because he might fight for the day. He might fight 3 fights in the tent, and might get £10 or £15 because he was the one who was drawing the people.
I gather you fought for a number of promoters. Who are some of the people you were with?
In the tent.
In the tents, yeah.
Oh, I worked with Percy Lennon. I worked with Sharman, and I worked with Johns. They were just ordinary fellas, everyday fellas. There was no difference in what the ordinary fella was.
I guess of the various promoters that you mentioned, the name of Jimmy Sharman is the most widely known. Can you tell us something about Sharman, what sort of person he was?
Well, Sharman was a very careful fellow, and he didn't overpay anyone, and he had a Chinaman with him named Rudd Key, and Rudd Key, they tell me Rudd Key's still alive, and I reckon he'd be 100-year-old if he was still alive, because he was an old man when I saw him, and he'd stopped working in the tent, but he used to be with Sharman, and Sharman got Rudd Key to invest his money into good investments, and they say that Rudd Key had nearly as much money as Sharman.
What about outside the ring as you're travelling around in country towns? Do you remember any good times? Did you get out on the tear, or...?
Oh, no, there was the tent promoter. He wouldn't let his tent fighters drink around the hotels or things like that because it got the tent a bad name.
What about romance? As a young man, visiting different towns, it'd be unusual not to sort of have a look at the local lasses and... Well,
you're too busy and you're too tired after you worked all day in the tent and then ended up getting it arranged next morning. Sometimes you'd pull down, you'd finish in the town in the night, 11 o'clock, and you'd pull the tent down, pack it up and travel to another town ready to start a show that day.
And be up early the next morning?
You wouldn't sleep. You'd only sleep while you're travelling in the vans, whichever way you're travelling.
Do you recall what sort of transport and that you used?
Oh, big vans, big motor trucks.
Were they like caravan trucks?
Big caravan trucks, and you'd put the tent and everything up, wrap the tent up and all that, and put it in the big trucks.
How many went out with a
show? Probably half a dozen. And probably a couple of fellas that would be working around the tents that wouldn't do any boxing.
Did any of the promoters take their families with them and live a bit like circus people?
They did, yes, they did. A lot of them travel like that. A lot of the promoters travel around. Harry Johns had sons that were boxers, fought under the name of Regan. One of his sons fought the name Regan. He wasn't a bad boy either.
What's your general feeling about that whole period? I mean, it's a very colourful part of Australian boxing lore. Do you think there were good times associated with that period?
Well, you were young and you thought it was good because you were in front of the public eye and they were making a fuss of you and telling all the people how good you were and all this, the promoter was. And I suppose it was a bit of you hadn't had that much experience of boxing and you thought that you were real good and you thought you were all right, but you got a bit of a kick out of that probably.
Would you do it again if you were a young man, do you think?
Oh, well, after what you've been through, you wouldn't do it again. But if you started off like young again, you probably would do it.
That period in the 30s was associated with the Depression years, and there were a lot of people on the road and hard times generally then. Did you see much of that side of life?
There was lots of showmen travelling and all sorts of showmen travelling. And in those days it was easy to get fellas to come into the tent because some of them couldn't fight all, some of them hadn't had a glove on and they'd want to get in to earn a little bit of money and they'd tell the boss they'd had experience and things like that. Well, they'd get in and he'd put them in for fights and lots of times they hadn't had much experience.
What made you give it away if you were around the tents for a few years, done well at boxing?
Well, when you were boxing and getting fights, well, you didn't worry about the tents. You didn't have anything to do with the tents, and lots of times the promoters would come and look for you to go to do a show, or you might only do one show for them, and wherever 50 or 60 mile out of Melbourne. But you didn't do much of it when you were boxing. You wouldn't do much of it. A lot of those fellas just concentrate on the tents, and that's all they do.
So you started to find that you were earning better money in the ring. It wasn't worth.
The life was hard on travelling around the country, getting up early and sleeping, not getting sleep and things like that, and you weren't training. You never got a chance to train because you weren't getting the proper training.
It's a sport that's come in for a lot of criticism in recent years, and many people say it should be banned. What are your feelings about it, looking back?
Boxing's put a lot of fellas into businesses and things like that and helped them through life. I think I don't think boxing should be banned. It is a very hard sport, though, and you've got to like it to keep going in it. I was never a drinker, I was never a smoker, and I was always keen on physical fitness. I still train 3 or 4 days a week now, skip and punch a bag, and I'm 74, but I'm still pretty fit. My weight's only 3 pound up or down over the welterweight limit now.
The 1940 Australian welterweight champion Terry Riley reminiscing about tent show boxing with Harry Martin.